Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the fine people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, it's a brand new year. Surely you'll have something interesting to say when I ask the question. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, it's a new year, and I talk about economics as part of my new job. I pay far closer attention to forecasts than I have in the past. And I can tell you that the forecasts I've seen, and I look at them on a spectrum, so I can see the people in the middle, the pessimists, the optimists. Even the pessimists are not seeing, for as far as their eye can see, which is about the beginning of 2026, are not seeing a recession. Now, you put a big footnote there that's assuming that black swan events don't occur. You don't get a tsunami or, outbreak of civil war in some major country or things like that. But putting aside stuff like that, even the pessimists don't see a recession. However, if you take that as the good news, the bad news is the average forecaster is seeing an economy that grows slower in 2025 than it did pre-COVID.
Which means probably slower than inflation.
Well, that's the other interesting thing, and I'd like to come back and do a larger episode on this. I've mentioned in the past, I suspect that we're in a new place where baseline inflation is going to be higher than what it was prior to COVID, and all the indications are there. I think the Fed moved too quickly in cutting interest rates. And you kind of see that in the numbers, and the Fed coming back and now saying things like inflation seems to be uncharacteristically stubborn. Well, yeah, that's because I think they gave up the fight too soon. But nonetheless, yeah, we're not going to see a recession. We're not going to see things going gangbusters like they did average prior to COVID, and we're going to see inflation run a little hotter than normal.
Right, but the point I'm getting to is that if inflation runs faster than economic growth, it's really not that great.
Yeah, well, when I say economic growth, I'm talking about inflation adjusted. So the economy will be growing faster than inflation, just not as fast as we were used to before all the nonsense.
So if everything goes according to plan, we should be out in front of this for a change.
Yeah, we'll be in front of it. Not as far as we'd like to be, but we'll be in front of it. And related to today's episode, you and I have talked for a long time about what we considered to be the largest threat to the U.S. economy coming down the pike, which is the debt. And I'm increasingly adding a second to that. That's population stagnation. And you're seeing this not just in the United States, but you're seeing it in developed countries across the planet. Their population's just stagnating. Russia, for example, I read somewhere recently, and don't quote me on this because the number seems extreme. I read that Russia has lost 700,000 troops in the Ukraine war in total. I can't imagine that's right. That number seems way too high.
Well, it's high enough, Ant, that they're importing North Korean soldiers.
Okay, granted, but whatever quantity of soldiers Russia has lost, whatever that number is, Russia, which has a near zero population growth rate, same as the United States, you lose people in war. You don't get that back. That becomes a permanent reduction in your population.
Yeah, and the data that I'm seeing is up to 120,000 Russian dead.
Really?
It's probably worse when you stop to think about it for a second, right? Because these are all men in a very specific demographic group. This is going to have a ripple effect later.
It puts war in a new light. I don't think we've ever had a situation in human history where populations weren't growing, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. But to be in a developed country, your population growth is zero. War takes on a whole new meaning here. It becomes a permanent problem. Or I should say the reduction in population becomes a permanent problem.
I've got something less interesting, I guess, or more interesting, depending on how you look at things. Do you happen to remember, Ant, when we talked about net neutrality, and then we talked about net neutrality again, and we talked about net neutrality again? I think that's how many times we did it.
We did, and every time people are losing their minds that it's going to be the death of the internet, and every time nothing happens.
Well, a federal appeals court struck down the FCC rules, I think, once and for all. So now I think we're officially done with net neutrality. We've been on both sides of this line so repeatedly that you have to know that this is a nothing.
Yeah.
This is a giant nothing. That the best thing to do would be to get the FCC the hell out of this, because what has the FCC ever gotten involved in that we all said, wow, thank God for their involvement? And here we are. I just wanted to point out one more time that here we are.
But this is an interesting thing because I read this in the court's ruling against the FCC. They cited the Supreme Court overturning the Chevron doctrine. And we had Clark on some time ago, Clark Neely, to talk about the Chevron doctrine. This is one of the things he said. This is going to change the face of regulatory rulings into the future.
I don't know what role Chevron played here. I just caught the headline and I said, you know what? Here we are. Let's just maybe forget about this from now on. But this, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And for this, Ant, oddly, I want to go to the East Coast, to the great state of New York, a place where I once lived. I'm not too sad that I don't live there anymore, given how these things go. But the governor in New York, one Governor Hochul, has declared that there is to be no fracking in the state of New York forever and for all time.
Okay.
Until Republicans take over the State House, which might be forever, given how things tend to work. But here's the thing. New York is sitting on $1 trillion worth of natural gas. $1 trillion that could be unlocked with simple fracking. Pennsylvania, another state controlled, as you well know, by a Democratic governor, they frack right away, and energy in Pennsylvania costs roughly half what it costs in New York.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting question. To what extent do the natural gas fields in New York State bump up against the Pennsylvania line? Because some enterprising drillers are going to just set up shop right along the Pennsylvania line, taking all that sweet New York State natural gas.
Yeah, that seems not to be the issue. The issue seems to be that the gas in New York is shared with Canada.
Oh, really?
Which makes it even more interesting.
And does Canada allow fracking, do you know?
Who the hell knows what those crackpots do up there? But they could. Even if they don't, they could, at the drop of a hat, decide that that's what they're going to do. And New York will be out on the tiles when that happens.
Yeah.
And, one asks the obvious question, what are you thinking? You're sitting on top of a gold mine. This is a money printing machine that New York is sitting on, and they refuse to take advantage of it as a matter of policy. Well, this isn't going to end well for the people of New York. New York is already an incredibly expensive place to live, and everything that New York could do to work against that type, they should be doing. And yet, here, a completely obvious thing that they could be doing, and they just choose not to.
And New York is, I believe it's the second state for out-migration, California being first. People are leaving. They've had enough of it. And as they do, New York State's tax revenues are going to decline.
That's right, because as we've covered here before, it's not the poor who leave. It's the tax base.
Yeah. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. This week, I'd like to talk about population density and the tendency of high-density areas in the United States to vote left and low-density areas to vote right. And in preparation for this discussion, I pulled together a heat map of the United States, two of them, one showing population density and the other showing the votes from the year 2020. But it shows, red, blue, how people voted down to a county level. And then the other map showing population density. And if you compare the two, it's not one for one, but it is remarkably close. The high density areas are voting Democrat. The low density areas are voting Republican. It's not, as people tend to think, a coastal thing that the coasts are uniformly vote Democrat. It does tend to be the case that high density areas are on the coasts. But when you break it down, again, by county, and you look at low-density areas on the coast, no, they're going Republican. It's very clearly a density issue. So my question is, what's going on there? And there's at least two possible answers, one being that people of a more liberal bent are attracted to high-density areas. The other that I tend to lend more credence to is the reverse. As an area becomes more high density, it tends politically more to the left, and you see that in, for example, Texas. Areas over time in Texas that have become higher and higher density have shifted slowly from red to purple to blue. So you're the political scientist. Tell me what's going on here.
Well, I think there's a lot going on here, and I think it probably resists the kind of easy analysis that you just offered, right? I think it's going to be both of the things that you mentioned. It's not one or the other. And I think we've talked about this before, right? This mirrors a problem, if you want to call it a problem. It mirrors an issue that we've had in the United States since the time of our founding, right? Where on the one hand, you've got the urban interests, and on the other hand, you've got the agrarian interests. And they broke down into two different political parties pretty quickly. And they were both large enough interests that they had to be accounted for, right? You couldn't say, well, we're going to break in favor of this or in favor of that. There was just no way to do that sort of thing. And I think what we've seen in the United States over 250 odd years is that that sort of thing has continued. And when you talk about the heat map that you took a look at earlier, most people, I think, have seen that county breakdown of the most recent election, which, if anything, was more pronounced than it was 4 years ago, which was, again, more pronounced than it was 4 years before that. So we are seeing a bit of a consolidation around these sorts of tendencies. Now, what it all means in the end, I don't think I know, right? But you know that there's an issue when you've got one party, the Democrats, who are very interested in doing away with the Electoral College, right? Very, very interested in doing away with it. Why? Because it gives more political power to things other than the cities. If we did away with the Electoral College tomorrow, 10 or 12 major cities would determine the presidency every single time. Right, which is clearly why the Republican Party will never let go of the Electoral College.
Yeah, now let me put a footnote there. I tend to think you're right. Your statement, 10 or 12 cities would determine the outcome. I went back and looked at historically presidential elections and asked how many of them would have gone the other way, other things equal, if the popular vote had decided the outcome versus the electoral vote. And the answer is very few of them. And those that would have gone the other way were pretty close. But here's the thing. You've said this before. I want to underline it. If we went by popular vote, it's not the going by popular vote that makes the difference. It's that changes the incentive of the politicians. They will campaign differently, and that will cause what you just said, that the 10 or 12 largest cities will decide the president.
It also changes the behavior of the electorate as well. Right. So if I'm a Republican living in California, I might never vote.
Right. What's the point? Exactly. Yeah.
If I were a Democrat living in Utah, again, what's the point? You know, you can't just point back and say, this is what would have happened. We absolutely don't know what would have happened. Common sense tells me what would happen. And that would be that the cities would rise to a heretofore unknown and unknowable level of influence in American politics. And that was a problem at the time of the founding that had to be dealt with, right? So when we think of it now as something other than a problem that has to be dealt with, we stand astride the founding of the country. And I think that's always a very dangerous thing to do. Now, I did a little digging on this one myself. I'm kind of curious about population density and all manner of things. And it's hard to get a sense of the partisan breakdown versus the ideological breakdown of cities. And those might not be the same thing, at least not exactly. But if you look at conservatism, how many conservative cities do we have? The answer is probably fewer than a dozen. You're looking at things like Mesa, Arizona, Oklahoma City, Colorado Springs.
But certainly not big cities.
Yeah, not New York, not Atlanta, not Boston, not anything in California outside of, say, Fresno, which is probably right on the line. And cities that we think of as being very conservative, comparatively speaking, are actually right on that center line between liberal and conservative. And here we're talking about places like Wichita, Kansas, Nashville, Corpus Christi, right? These sorts of cities. If we were considering these things, these places in a vacuum, we wouldn't consider them conservative at all. But because we put them in the population of American cities, now all of a sudden we do. That probably doesn't do us a whole lot of good.
I want to propose a hypothesis. And I have lived my adult life in some of the lowest density, middle of nowhere, West Virginia. We lived in a community of 50 people, and it was the largest collection of humans for an hour drive in any direction. Right? It's extremely low density. And now I live in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, and the population of Fairfax County rivals the population of the entire state of West Virginia. And I've noticed something about myself. As much of a wannabe anarchist as I am, I've found myself thinking more in terms of government since I've moved here. And I'm asking the question, why? The only thing I can point to is the following. In a low-density area, when I lived in this little village in West Virginia, if you had a problem with your neighbor, you could go and talk to your neighbor. And if your neighbor was not amenable, you could talk to your other neighbors. And through social pressure, you could get whatever problem it was that needed fixing fixed. But in a high-density area, you have two problems. One, if you've got someone whose behavior is bad, however you want to define bad, it's now impacting far more people than it would impact in a low-density area. And there's a much lower probability that you know the person, that you can go and say, hey, I need you to cut this out, or that you're able to talk to other people who know the person, bring social pressure to bear. None of those social tools seem to work in a high-density area, and that leaves me only with turning to government. Now, that doesn't justify turning to federal government, but it does somehow explain turning to government, at least at a local level.
You've overlooked another thing, right? You're 30 years older now than you were then. And people have this tendency to become, I hesitate to say more progressive, but they become more liberal over time.
Really? I thought it was the reverse.
Really?
Well, I mean, you see amongst college students, they're being so liberal until they get a job and start paying taxes.
Oh, sure. And let me be clear, I'm removing those lunatics from the entire equation.
Okay.
I don't take all that seriously what 18 to 24-year-olds believe deep in their hearts. They don't have enough experience to believe much of anything. But people, as they go from 30 to 40 to 50 to 60, they become, I think, a lot more tolerant of one another. They become interested in the sorts of things that they would never have been interested in when they were 20 years younger.
Before we go too far, given that so many of our listeners are in the 18 to 24 year bracket, let me say something in their defense, which is, and I'm with you 100%, that 18 to 24-year-olds lack the wisdom that comes with experience. But I have found that they do bring to the table, when they bring their idealism, the ability to remind those of us who are older of things that we once held dear, and to revisit them in light of the wisdom and experience we now have. And I think without young people's idealism, those of us who have the experience and now are in a position to make decisions that the 18 to 24-year-olds can't, without them become somewhat moribund, somewhat set in our ways.
That might be right. To at least some degree, I'm sure it is right. I don't know to what degree I would follow that all the way down. I don't know that I would take it as far as you just did, but I would take it at least halfway down the road you just walked. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was a young man, and I believed some goofy right? And I'm sure that in 20 years, if I should happen to live that long, I'll look back on my life now and think, well, I believed some goofy shit. Mm-hmm. You tend to change over time, and I'm fine with that. in the grand scheme of things, ask yourself this, and I would ask young people to ask themselves this too. Who would you rather running everything? Younger people or older people, just by and large? And if you say younger people, you're a crazy person. Do older people get many things wrong? Yes, indeed they do. Do they get more things right than they did when they were younger? Yes, they do. But I don't know where this plays, right? I don't know about demographic shifts in the city versus rural areas in the United States. Are the cities getting older? Do people move out of cities? I don't know that to be true.
Right.
The people who want urban living tend to want urban living their entire lives. They tend not to shift back and forth. And it would be easy to say, well, a lot of big government types, they gravitate towards the cities and they stay there. But how many small government types do you find out in the country? And notice, I'm not asking about Republicans and Democrats. I know you find more Republicans per capita out in the sticks, but are they small government types? And given how much welfare flows to that part of the country, I don't think they are. We always just overlook that sort of thing. So I think there's two things going on. I think there's a partisan difference and an ideological difference. And they're not the same difference. They overlap to some degree, but they don't overlap nearly perfectly.
That's very interesting. I hadn't considered that.
Well, think about it in this way. Think about that last election we just had. Is Donald Trump and the whole MAGA movement, is that a conservative movement? I don't know anybody who would say yes, not seriously. It's a movement, it's a Republican movement, but it's not a conservative movement. It has conservative elements, but it's a populist movement. And that took up the entire red portion of the map. Now, how does the conservative-liberal divide play? I don't know, but it's not blue and red. You see what I'm getting at? It's always way more complicated than it first appears to be, especially when it first appears to be a binary difference.
So just taking a side trip for a moment, is it your opinion that there's a change underfoot, that the Republican Party is ceasing to be a party of conservatives and becoming a party of populists?
I would say yes. In fairness, members of that party would say, well, not so fast. You can redefine conservatism to a point. And look, we have redefined conservatism over the years, just as we've redefined liberalism. What was once liberal is now conservative. What was once conservative is now unfathomable. I don't know what labels we want to put on these things, because these are breathing political movements that never really take a firm stand in the ground, right? They just keep moving over time. Do we want to keep using the words liberal and conservative? I mean, I'd rather not. To me, it's populists and progressives right now. It's not liberals and conservatives at all.
For our listeners, what does this mean to be a populist?
Populism is the ability, I'm going to speak in terms I'm comfortable with, not terms that our listeners are going to be comfortable with. Populism is the ability of a demagogue to grab upon the worst instincts of the populace, whip them up into a lather, frighten them, and move forward with that. And in my mind, that's what Trumpism is. You get a perfect example of this when he talks about how we must keep immigrants out. And we had the recent terrorism, the truck plowing over people in
New Orleans.
Yeah. Just a few days ago as we record this. And Trump came out and whipped up his base saying, this is why we must keep the immigrants out. But it was a natural-born American. It had nothing to do with that. But try to tell that to the people who he whipped up. If you ask them in a month, was that an immigrant? A good solid number of them are going to say yes, and that's why we need to keep those bastards out. Right? This is populism at its worst. We typically think of Andrew Jackson, and now we think of Donald Trump when we think of populism in the United States. And, the progressives on the other side are every bit as ridiculous. I think these are just reconstituted Marxists when it comes right down to it. You're looking at these two groups of people, neither of which is particularly helpful. Right? It makes me pine for the days of honest liberals and honest conservatives. I miss them both.
Going back to this issue of high-density areas moving to the left and my own experience of at least coming to understand a little bit more what their thinking must be, none of that I see as a problem until you do away with federalism. Because as long as you have federalism, let the cities be as blue as they want to be, let them make whatever rules they want to make, but they apply to the cities. Let the states do the same thing. The problem comes when they try and impose their will on everybody else.
Well, yeah, in the electoral sense, right, when we talk about things like, oh, let's move to a popular vote, that's exactly what you're saying will happen. That's exactly what would happen. But let's be careful, because I think we haven't really had federalism since 1870 or so, not in the way that it was designed. We haven't had it because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which are the Civil War amendments, right? And we had those amendments for a perfectly good reason. The federalism we had allowed slavery. Well, you really can't have that, can you? And you certainly can't have it in the wake of a civil war, the bloodiest war in human history to that point, which was dedicated in no small part. Don't believe the hype. The Civil War was about slavery, right? So anything that happens after the Civil War has to preclude the possibility of slavery, even if it's only intellectual. Mm-hmm. Even if it's not going to happen again, given political history, you still have to make sure that you nail it down. And that's what we did. Well, when you do that, well, then certain things are also of necessity lost. And we ended up with a radically nationalized system compared to what we had previously. At the time of the founding, if you read The Federalist by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in essays in support of the Constitution, you see that they speak of the United States as being, or as aspiring to be, partly national and partly federal. And we've lost the federal element, right? When states and counties and cities and towns simply become administrative subdivisions of the federal government, it's nationalist at that point. Mm-hmm. We're left with the observation that where we have population density, we have people who are left of center. Where we have sparser populations, it becomes far less left of center. And I don't know that that matters all that much, except to say what we're looking at is a brilliant political architecture designed 250 years ago, give or take, that foresaw this very problem and solved it to the extent it could be solved. Mm-hmm. Now, everybody wants everything to be solved perfectly all the time. That's not going to happen. Politically, you're going to have to do the best you can do. And I think federalism as it was and is more or less as good as it's ever going to get. So you should probably just take a deep breath, put your feet up and say, let's move on to the next issue.
It's funny listening to you. What's coming back is memories of conversations along these lines we've had in the past. And the thought that we broke the country with slavery and the Civil War. So many times when I ask you about some problem that exists now, you point back to some change that was necessary because of slavery and the Civil War.
Sure. And when you've got a country premised on the assertion that all men are created equal, at the exact moment that you're enslaving a bunch of human beings, you've got trouble. Mm-hmm. It turns out there was no peaceful answer to that trouble. The Civil War was, in fact, the price we paid in blood for our own misbegotten behavior. Well, okay, so be it. But understand that that carries with it all kinds of baggage that never really goes away. You know, whatever we do now, we have to look back to that problem and always ask the essential question, would this have permitted anything approaching that? And if the answer is yes, you can't do it, because that's our heritage. And we just have to be better than that. And sometimes that means taking what we think might be the best answer to a problem off the table. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.